At one time, prominent liberals did not deny Economics 101, that the minimum wage law destroys jobs for the very people that the left claims to care about, unskilled workers, many of whom are black and brown and female. One such prominent left-wing voice, Jonathan Gruber, the architect of Romney Care and one of the co-architects of Obamacare. The MIT economist gave a lecture at MIT in which he said, quote, "Let's say the government rolled in and set a minimum wage. Workers want to supply more hours than firms want to hire. You end up with excess supply. We call that excess supply unemployment." And as to whether the minimum wage induces employers to automate, here's what economist Kruger said. "We have a downward sloping demand curve. And why is it downward sloping? Because the higher the minimum wage, the fewer workers the firm wants to hire. It would rather use machines instead." End of quote. Goodness. And as to government required paid family leave, here's what economist Gruber said. In 1994, Mr. Gruber said, quote, "I studied several state and federal mandates which stipulated that childbirth be covered comprehensively in health insurance plans, raising the relative cost of insuring women of childbearing age. I find substantial shifting of the cost of these mandates to the wages of the targeted group." End of quote. In English, that means when an employer is forced to pay for mandatory family leave, that employer simply deducts the value of that from the wages of the employee. This brings us to Paul Krugman. Paul Krugman is another left-wing economist. He writes a column with the New York Times. In a review that supported a living wage, like a minimum wage, Krugman trashed it. Here's what he said. "The living wage movement is simply a move to raise minimum wages through local action. So what are the effects of increasing minimum wages? Any Econ 101 student can tell you the answer. The higher wage reduces the quantity of labor demanded and hence leads to unemployment." End of quote. Wow. Krugman even trashed probably the most widely cited study for the minimum wage. It's called the Kruger study. And what happened is that New Jersey and Pennsylvania are side by side. One state raised the minimum wage, the other one didn't. And economists looked at whether or not the state that raised the minimum wage saw a decline in jobs relative to the state that didn't. And according to this study, the state that raised the minimum wage saw a benefit, which is exactly the opposite of what most economists have said in the past and what most economists would have predicted. Krugman did not buy the study. Indeed, much cited studies by two well-regarded labor economists, David Card and Alan Kruger, found that when New Jersey raised minimum wages, but Pennsylvania did not, the effects have been negligible or even positive. Exactly what to make of this result is a source of great dispute. Card and Kruger offered some complex theoretical rationales, but most of their colleagues are unconvinced. The centrist view is probably that minimum wages do, in fact, reduce employment. End of quote. Krugman has since done a 180 on the minimum wage, citing its popularity. Popularity is not Economics 101, is it? Now, do you know who Gruber and Krugman sound like on the minimum wage? The late, great Nobel laureate Milton Friedman.
The people who have been hurt most by minimum wage laws are the blacks. I have often said that the most anti-Negro law on the books of this land is the minimum wage rate. And so I think the real answer to your question is that you must not judge a bottle solely by its label. You have to look at what's inside and see what the law or the measure produces.
Elder here for Birch Gold. As one of the top dealers of physical precious metals in the United States, Birch Gold Group helps Americans diversify their savings with gold and silver. Customers can purchase for physical possession or convert a portion of their IRA or 401k into an IRA backed by physical precious metals. And for the first time since Obama's first term, we are facing a democratically controlled White House, Senate, and House. Sounds like a lot of tax and spending to me. Get ready for more so-called quantitative easing. Now, how does that affect your investment? How does that affect the strength of your portfolio? So, contact Birch Gold Group to request a free info kit on physical precious metals. See if diversifying into gold makes sense for you. This comprehensive 20-page kit reveals how gold and silver can protect your savings and how you can legally move your IRA or 401k out of risky stocks and bonds into a precious metals IRA. To get your no-cost, no-obligation kit, text Larry to 474747. That's text Larry to 474747. And for a limited time, see how you can qualify for up to $10,000 in free precious metals on your purchase. Text Larry to 474747. Text Larry to 474747 because we've got a country to save. Now, do you know what other liberal organization once opposed the minimum wage way back in 1987? The New York Times. January 1987 editorial, the right minimum wage, 0.00. Quote, there's a virtual consensus among economists that the minimum wage is an idea whose time has passed. Raising the minimum wage by a substantial amount would price poor working people out of a job. Most important, it would increase unemployment. Raise the legal minimum price of labor above the productivity of the least skilled workers, and fewer will be hired, end of quote. No, you're not imagining things. Again, New York Times, January 1987. If a higher minimum wage means fewer jobs, why does it remain on the agenda of some liberals? A higher minimum wage would undoubtedly raise the living standard of the majority of low-wage workers who could keep their jobs. That gain, it is argued, would justify the sacrifice of the minority who became unemployable. The argument isn't convincing. Those at greatest risk from a higher minimum wage would be young, poor workers who already face formidable barriers to getting and keeping jobs, end of quote. That's right. The same newspaper that now supports a $15 minimum wage said the very opposite just 34 years ago. The idea of using a minimum wage to overcome poverty is old, honorable, and fundamentally flawed. It's time to put this hoary debate behind us and find a better way to improve the lives of people who work very hard for very little, end of quote. Goodness. The New York Times actually sounded like Walter Williams and Thomas Sowell, both of whom argued vigorously against the minimum wage.
I left home in 1948. Many decades later, I learned that the unemployment rate among black teenagers in 1948, 16, 17-year-olds, was 9.4%. Among whites of the same age, it was 10.2%. So both blacks and white teenagers had only a fraction of the unemployment that they have today.
You were expected to work. You were expected to be able to get a job.
And more importantly, the jobs were there for you. This is because of a fluke, really. The minimum wage law in the United States, Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, was passed with specified rates of pay that you're supposed to get. Almost immediately, inflation took off during the 1940s. So by 1948, those numbers that were in the law were meaningless.
Oh, I see.
In other words, when I started out as a Western Union messenger, the minimum wage was 40 cents an hour. I started out at the bottom at 65 cents an hour. So it was the same as if there was no minimum wage. And this is what happened. You had this, and I was so lucky. I knew, of course, had no clue about any of this. Now a black kid 20 years later comes in there. People have become compassionate. They've raised the minimum wage, so he can't get a job.
Got it.
And I don't think it does any community any good to have a whole lot of teenage males hanging around on the streets with no job and nothing to do.
A lot of people say the minimum wage law is an anti-poverty device. It reduces poverty. Well, that doesn't even pass the smell test. I mean, because if it were an anti-poverty device, rather than are spending all these millions and billions of dollars in foreign aid, we just tell Bangladesh and Haiti, you could be rich like we are, just have a higher minimum wage. That's just utter nonsense. And then also, the empirical evidence on the minimum wage law, in 1948, the unemployment rate among black teenagers was 9.4%.
1948.
1948. The unemployment rate among white teenagers was like 10.2.
So it's
The labor-
lower.
Huh?
for
It was
it's
lower.
lower for blacks than whites.
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
and the labor force participation rates for black teenagers were greater than white teenagers. Matter of fact, it was 106%. And so you say, well, how come in 1948? Was there less discrimination? Is that why? Or were blacks more in 1948 higher skilled than whites? No, it was the minimum wage law. And then also the extent of coverage of the minimum wage law, because when it first came out, I think, I'm not absolutely sure, it only covered about 40-some% of jobs. And so if you were thrown out of a job because of minimum wage law, there was this uncovered sector that you could go to. But now I think the minimum wage law covers like 98% or virtually all jobs.
And then there's the story of George McGovern. George McGovern was the Democrat presidential candidate in 1972, the most left-wing candidate until Barack Obama. And he retired from the Senate, went on the lecture circuit, saved all his money, and bought an inn in Connecticut. Always wanted to run an inn, a breakfast inn, a restaurant, got the best consultants, experts, bought an inn, and went bust. And when he went bust, he realized one of the reasons was because of all the rules and regulations that were imposed on businesses, some of which he wrote when he was in the Senate. And a forlorn McGovern, when he went busted, wrote this in the Wall Street Journal. I wish I had known more firsthand about the concerns and problems of American business people while I was a U.S. Senator and later a presidential nominee. That knowledge would have made me a better legislator and a more worthy aspirant to the White House. I learned, first of all, that over the past 20 years, America has become the most litigious society in the world. The second lesson I learned by owning the Stratford Inn is that legislators and government regulators must more carefully consider the economic and management burdens we have been imposing on U.S. businesses. Many businesses, especially small independents, such as the Stratford Inn, simply can't pass such costs onto their customers and remain competitive or profitable, end of quote. Really? And in 2008, McGovern went even further and criticized excessive regulation. Under the guise of protecting us from ourselves, the right and left are becoming ever more aggressive in regulating behavior. Since leaving office, I've written about public policy from a new perspective, outside looking in. I've come to realize that protecting freedom of choice in our everyday lives is essential to maintaining a healthy civil society. Why do we think we are helping adult consumers by taking away their options? We don't take away cars because we don't like some people speeding. We allow state lotteries despite knowing some people are betting their grocery money. Everyone is exposed to economic risk of some kind, but we don't operate mindlessly in trying to smooth out every theoretical wrinkle in life. The nature of freedom of choice is that some people will misuse their responsibility and hurt themselves in the process. We should do our best to educate them, but without diminishing choice for everyone else. End of quote. Finally, if this story does not tell you how bad minimum wage laws are, I don't know what will. You remember ACORN, that organization that kind of went supernova a few years ago? Well, in the 90s, ACORN came out here to California. They wanted to gather signatures to get a petition to put a measure on the ballot to raise the California minimum wage. ACORN went to court and filed a brief to exempt ACORN from the then minimum wage requirements of California so it could hire more workers. I kid you not. This is from their own brief that they filed with the court. In its brief to exempt itself from California's then minimum wage requirements, ACORN said, and I'm quoting, "The more ACORN must pay each individual outreach worker, either because of minimum wage or overtime requirements, the fewer outreach workers it will be able to hire. End of quote. You cannot make this up. Now, remember, we have been demonetized by YouTube. So to get me unbridled, uncensored, and on demand, go to larrytube.com. That's just larrytube.com, because we've got a country to save. And I will see you next time.